want to go into our Q&A portion now. So if there were any questions that came up for you during Dr. Rattan Lal or Dr. William Keepin's presentation, for those in person, we will have someone going around with a mic, but if you could raise your hand and we'll bring the mic to you. If you're joining on Zoom and you have a question, please raise your hand. Either you can do it on Zoom or physically raise your hand and we will make sure that we can unmute you and hear you. But if you can mention who your question is for and ask your question. So does anyone have any questions for our last two presenters?
My name is Alyssa Thomas. That one's working. And I work at California State University, Fullerton, where we have a arboretum and botanical garden that's used to educate our students, faculty, and staff and assist with their research. And I was wondering, when you talked about carbon sequestration in the soil and the deeper and broader the roots, the better this carbon sequestration. How would you do that or advise doing that across different soil types and climates? You know, how does that translate into the Southern California region, which is struggling to get people to change to more native and drought-tolerant plant, you know, instead of like the square, you know, of turf, you know, green turf in the yards and such?
Yes, that's a very good question. There are indeed 300,000 known soil series. And to assume that one technique can be adopted in all of that, that would be rather too simplistic. So, but there are some basic principles. For example, we talk about soil disturbance minimum, keep the ground always covered. There should be green cover on the land all the time. We must have enough food for microorganism and soil biota. Whatever you take from soil, you must return it back. And those principles hold true universally. And those principles can be adopted and adapted by fine-tuning for a specific soil series or for given biophysical and socioeconomic condition. So in general, conservation agriculture, agroforestry, returning the nutrients taken from the land back to the land, maintaining soil structure, those basic principles do apply everywhere. I have worked on 6 continents for almost 60 years now. And I think from these very clay soils of Narrabri in Australia, New South Wales, to very sandy soil of sub-Saharan Africa, those principles hold true. But the techniques do differ. And their fine-tuning is the research that's called local specific research that needs to be done. Thank you. That was a good question.
Thank you, Dr. Lal. Does anyone else have a question they would like to ask? Oh, is there someone on Zoom?
Hello, Dr. Lal. Thank you for your presentation. That was very, very informative. I have a question. You were talking about plants that are able to, like that can withstand climate change, having those plants planted in one of your slides. So I was wondering, like, how is biodiversity going to be affected if we advocate for plants that can withstand climate change?
Dr. Das, you bring out a very important question. The system that I gave an example, I indicate those plants should have a deep root system. They should also have a large biomass. They should have chemical nature that doesn't decompose very quickly. But at the same time, I also insisted integrating crops with trees and livestock, if you remember the whole complex system. And I mentioned soil health. And health soil means soil has a microbial and living biomass carbon about 5 metric ton per hectare. That's 5,000 pounds per acre. That's earthworm, termites, centipedes, millipedes. That is the soil biodiversity. The largest biodiversity in the terrestrial biosphere is the soil. And therefore, that complex system crop that produces large biomass has a large root, deeper absorptive and transmissive roots, and not decomposing very rapidly. If those plants can be integrated with trees and livestock under site-specific condition, that will promote biodiversity. And higher the biodiversity in the soil, soil naturally becomes disease suppressive. These are called disease suppressive soils. They have a capacity to suppress pests and pathogen. Like healthy human have an immune system to suppress pests and pathogen. So those questions are both yours and the previous one are a very nice question, but the answer lies in feeding the soil. Plants' food is the same like we have biomass. So do not burn the biomass, do not take it away, return back to the soil. So grains are for people, biomass for the soil, and that equity must be maintained and respected.
Thank you, Dr. Lan.
Thank you, Dr. Lal. All right, does anyone else have any question they'd like to ask? I will go to Dr. Sullivan.
So I wanted to ask Dr. Keepin, there's so much in that presentation. From the viewpoint of talking especially about heart, from the viewpoint of human relationships, this kind of co-presence of us to each other and of, we could say, the divine, broadly speaking, co-present with us in our relationships. So I wonder if you could speak to that as well. So in the inner side, there's a universe to be explored. But then what about then in the in-between? What's the reality of this in-between?
Well, thank you. Well, first of all, I just want to say the heart is the primary primary organ of spiritual perception. And that transcends what the mind can comprehend. So the mind divides and analyzes. The heart unites and synthesizes and perceives directly. So when I'm talking about the heart, I'm really talking about a capacity that is not fully developed in many people. And our current science, it's remarkable that we live in a culture enamored with the love of science, but we have failed to develop a real science of love. And when we do, what will come forward, in my view, is what the mystics have known down through the ages, which is the heart is the spiritual center of our being. And that is how we know what we know, and that transcends mental conceptual knowledge completely. And that's where we connect with one another at a very deep level. It's not visible to our physical eyes. Our minds and our physical eyes deceive us into believing in separation. You know, your body's there, my body's here, we're all separate. But that's not the truth of the reality. The reality is that on the spiritual plane, we are profoundly interconnected, and that we can access that level through deep spiritual transformation, which is a whole process that we have to go through. And that process is broadly similar across all of the major spiritual traditions. There's processes of spiritual purification and then awakening of these faculties. And unless we make that connection to our deep source of spiritual intuition in the depths of our heart, we can't really advance spiritually, in my view. And so this idea of the heart is not some fluffy emotional center. It is the foundation of our deepest knowing. And when the Dalai Lama said that fourth step of the deepest secrets, he's really talking about a whole transformation of the human being into the primary receptivity of the heart as the way of knowing. And this then awakens us to a deeper knowing of one another. And all the sources of sort of non-verbal communication have their roots in that, which are now being found to be validated. You know, telepathy, for example, there's 150 scientific studies showing that it's valid, as well as some of the paranormal phenomena and the near-death experience data. We're seeing that even through the scientific data that's coming, is that the human being is far more profound than just a biological robot with a computer for a brain and a pump for a heart and a bunch of valves and levers for the body. It's an utterly impoverished view of the true nature of the human. So part of it is awakening to the truth, the deepest truth of who we are.
Thank you, Dr. Keepin. There's so many profound things in that I don't know, there's so much to break down, but I really appreciate that point, that heart. It's not just that fluffy emotional, but it's really the foundation. I think that's a really key point. Wow, thank you so much. And thank you to everyone who asked a question. Oh, we have one last question from Professor Egbunike.
Thank you. This has been very intriguing from everybody, from all the presentations. I don't know if there's an answer to this, but I'm going to ask. When you reason back to the hearts from 60 years ago to the hearts of today, what seemed to be the difference from, I don't know, like I said, I don't know if there's an answer to it. I'm looking at it from the human perspective. I mean, 60 years ago, where the human heart was to where the human hearts are today in relation to human beings. Is there any difference from yours? You know, could there be any study to prove the differences? Naturally, we can see it, right? But from the studies, what do you think?
Thank you, Professor Egbunike, for your question.
Well, I certainly don't know, but I can briefly speculate. I think that human consciousness does evolve. And so as it evolves, our hearts expand. And from 60 years ago, I think there has been a deeper global awakening of compassion, mutual awareness, but it's a long process, and we're a long ways from where we need to get to. So that's my short answer. I guess I'll just say that the mind is not capable of grasping the totality of reality, in my view. Therefore, one of the biggest impediments to science right now is relying on the human mind as its foundation of epistemological instrument. We need a science of the fullness of our humanity, and that, I believe, will be centered in the heart. And all the mystics have said a version of this. You know, John of the Cross, the Christian mystic, said, you know, that we have to transcend all knowledge, and that we advance by not understanding. The insistence on trying to understand everything through the mind is a big limitation, because that stops us at that development. And I think that awareness is growing greatly. So that's another shift in the last 60 years. Actually, one of my physicist friends, Ravi Ravindra, put it beautifully. He said the greatest scientific discovery of the 20th century was not any of the advances, quantum physics, DNA, none of it. The greatest scientific discovery of the 20th century was the discovery of the limitations of science. Because that discovery enables us to broaden our deep inquiry into the nature of reality through the spiritual dimensions. And that is slowly becoming legitimized as kind of part of the broader science. But we still have a long ways to go.
Thank you, Dr. Keepin. So if we can give one more round of applause to everyone who asked a question, and to Dr. Lal and Dr. Keepin for answering.
Can I make a brief comment? Can I make a brief comment?
Oh, yes, Dr. Lal.
From all the questions that I heard, I would like to share with you for a moment a quotation from Upanishad. And the quotation says, "You are what your deep driving desire is. As your desire is, so is your will. As your will is, so is your deed. As your deed is, so is your destiny." If you have a strong willpower, you can overcome those problems.
Thank you, Dr. Law. I think that's a powerful note to end our Q&A on. If we have the willpower, we can change our destiny.